You're standing at the edge of a stone circle, 20 meters above the desert floor. The wind carries something metallic, something wrong. Below you, arranged in perfect geometric sections, lie dozens of bodies under the open sky. Naked, silent, waiting. And then you hear it, the sound of wings, hundreds of them, descending in a spiral. The vultures have arrived for their sacred duty, and you realize with creeping horror that this isn't a massacre. This is a funeral, the most honorable death a person could receive in one of history's greatest empires. Before we descend into this world together, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? It amazes me every single time that a story from ancient Persia can reach someone in Sao Paulo, Seoul, or Seattle, all searching for the same unsettling truth about what humans once called normal. This is Persia, not the Persia of fairy tales and perfumed gardens, though those existed too. This is the empire that stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean, that built Persepolis with columns reaching toward heaven, that created the first declaration of human rights, and simultaneously devised punishments so elaborate, so psychologically devastating, that Greek historians couldn't decide whether to admire or recoil. Between the 6th century BCE and the fall of the Sasanian Empire in 651 CE, the Persians built something unprecedented, a civilization that worshipped purity with such intensity that death itself became a carefully choreographed ritual to protect the living from corruption. But purity, it turns out, demands a price. And in Persia, that price was paid in ways that would redefine what mercy, justice, and even love could mean. The Zoroastrian priests who shaped Persian law didn't see death the way we do, as an ending, a loss, a moment of grief. They saw it as contamination. When the soul departed, what remained wasn't a person anymore. It was nasu, corpse matter, a breeding ground for the Druj, the cosmic force of decay and lies. To bury this pollution in sacred earth, to burn it in sacred fire, or to let it touch sacred water would be to wound the universe itself. So they invented the Dakma, the Tower of Silence, and turned death into theater. Picture the procession. The deceased, wrapped in plain cloth, carried by Nasasalars, corpse-bearers who would be considered ritually impure for days afterward and would have to live in isolation. No family members touched the body. No one wept too close. Grief itself could spread contamination through tears and breath. The tower rose ahead, circular and stone, its top open to the sky like a mouth waiting to swallow. At the summit, the body was unwrapped and placed in one of 3 concentric rings. Outer for men, middle for women, inner for children. Face up. Eyes open to heaven. Within hours, sometimes minutes, the vultures would arrive. The Zoroastrians didn't see this as desecration. The birds were purifiers, creatures of the air element, carrying away the pollution bite by bite until only bleached bones remained in the central pit, where rain and time would finish what the vultures began. But here's what the Greek travelers couldn't understand, what even modern archaeologists struggle to explain. This wasn't cruelty. To the Persians, this was love. The ultimate act of protecting your family, your community, your world from the creeping corruption of death. The speed of it, the efficiency, the absolute erasure, this was considered merciful. What seems horrifying to us was, to them, the only honorable path. And if the body was the source of pollution, then everything connected to it had to be purified. Enter Gomez, bull's urine, collected from sacred temple herds and stored in clay vessels like liquid gold. This wasn't a fringe ritual performed by fanatics in desert caves. This was standard procedure, codified in the Vendidad, one of Zoroastrianism's most important legal texts. Anyone who touched a corpse had to be washed 3 times with bull's urine while priests recited specific formulas. The words mattered. Silence would allow the Druj to hide, to slip past the ritual into the living world. The urine itself came from bulls that had never worked a field, never mated, never been struck, living vessels of purity. When you cut your hair, especially after a death, you couldn't just discard it. Hair and nails retained the memory of the body, tiny anchors for evil that could last for years. They had to be burned in a separate fire, one that would never touch temple flames after being washed in, you guessed it, bull's urine. The obsession extended to water with terrifying precision. If a corpse or even a drop of blood touched a river, that river was considered wounded. The priests would arrive with chalices, dried plants, and ash to perform a healing ritual lasting up to 9 days. They believed the water itself, Appa, a feminine divine essence, was suffering, losing vitality, becoming unable to nourish crops or quench thirst. The Vendidad prescribed lashes for anyone who defiled water, because you weren't just breaking a rule. You were committing violence against a living goddess. But pollution wasn't the only thing the Persians feared. They feared corruption of a different kind, the corruption of justice itself. And when King Darius discovered that one of his high judges, Sisamnes, had accepted bribes, he didn't simply execute him. Darius was building an empire that would span 3 continents, and he needed judges who could not be bought, threatened, or swayed. So he turned Sisamnes into a lesson that would outlive them both. After the execution, Darius ordered the judge's skin flayed from his body, not as a trophy, as upholstery. The skin was stretched and tanned, then used to cover the very chair Sisamnes had sat in while dispensing corrupt justice. And here's the detail that transforms this from mere brutality into psychological mastery. Darius appointed Sisamnes's own son as the new judge. Every single day the son would sit in that chair, feeling his father's skin beneath him, a constant physical reminder of the price of betrayal. It was intimate horror as legal philosophy. The message wasn't, "We will punish you." It was, "We will make your punishment inseparable from your identity, from your family, from the very act of judging." The Persians believed punishment should match not just the crime, but the cosmic disturbance it created. For ordinary murders or thefts, execution might be avoided entirely. Remember, spilling blood polluted the earth. Instead, the condemned might be sealed in a stone chamber and left to die of thirst, dissolving without leaving a trace. But for those who truly offended the cosmic order, traitors, heretics, those who lied under sacred oath, the Persians invented punishments that blurred the line between execution and performance art. There was the Tower of Ash, a structure 20 meters high, filled with fine, caustic powder. The condemned would be thrown from the top, not to die from the fall, but to drown slowly in clouds of choking dust stirred by mechanical wheels. There was scaphism, the boats, a punishment so infamous that ancient historians wondered if it was real or myth. The victim was trapped between 2 sealed vessels, force-fed milk and honey until their digestive system failed, their body marinating in its own waste while insects devoured them alive over days, sometimes weeks. One historical account claims a victim survived 17 days, though by then his mind was long gone. And then there was what happened to Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, captured after a failed campaign against Shapur-Lenher. Valerian wasn't simply imprisoned. He was transformed into a living symbol of Persia's dominance. Kept in chains, he was forced to kneel whenever the Persian king mounted his horse, his back used as a footstool before the assembled armies. When Shapur finally tired of the spectacle, he ordered molten gold poured down Valerian's throat, a grotesque echo of Rome's obsession with wealth, weaponized into execution. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating punishment wasn't physical at all. It was erasure. If you betrayed the empire, your name would be systematically removed from every document, every inscription, every temple offering. Archivists would scrub tablets, chisel away stone carvings, destroy clay seals. Your house might be leveled. Your relatives would be forbidden from speaking your name under penalty of law. This wasn't just about forgetting you. Zoroastrians believed that without your name, your soul couldn't cross the Chinvat Bridge, the pathway to the afterlife. You would be trapped in a limbo beyond death itself, erased from past, present, and future simultaneously. Yet here's the paradox that makes ancient Persia so difficult to judge from our modern perspective. The same culture that invented these horrors also pioneered concepts of justice that wouldn't appear in Europe for another 1,000 years. Persian law stated explicitly that no one should be executed for a first offense, that all of a person's good deeds must be weighed against their crimes, that even the king himself was subject to law, a radical idea in an age of god-kings and absolute monarchs. The Cyrus Cylinder, often called the first Charter of Human Rights, declared that conquered peoples should be allowed to keep their religions and customs, that forced labor should be abolished. How do you reconcile this? How does the same mind that says, "Weigh all good deeds before punishing," also design a tower specifically for suffocation by ash? The answer lies in that obsession with order, Asha, the cosmic balance that governed everything. To the Zoroastrian mind, mercy and brutality weren't opposites. They were both tools for maintaining equilibrium. Be lenient with first offenses because humans make mistakes, and mistakes can be corrected without disrupting the cosmic order. But when someone truly broke that order through corruption, blasphemy, betrayal, then the response had to be proportionally severe, not out of vengeance, but to restore balance. This same logic extended into areas we find even more disturbing. The practice of Kvayetvadatta, sanctioned marriage between close blood relatives, sometimes brother and sister, occasionally father and daughter, appears in Zoroastrian texts like the Bunda-Hishan, not as a taboo broken in secret, but as something potentially blessed by the divine. The reasoning: purity of bloodline and faith was paramount. If two righteous Zoroastrians married, the child was blessed. If they were also blood relatives, the blessing was doubled, the purity intensified. It was rare, mostly confined to priestly families, but its very existence in the sacred texts tells us how differently they conceptualized corruption. External mixing threatened order. Internal concentration preserved it. Even childhood was structured around this cosmic hierarchy. Boys didn't meet their fathers until age 5, not from cruelty but from pragmatism. Why bond with a child who might not survive infancy in an era of high mortality? Once they reached 5, their education began, focused on 3 skills: horsemanship, archery, and truth-telling. That last one wasn't metaphorical. Lying was considered a form of druj, cosmic deception, one of the worst sins imaginable. Better to die than to lie, better to lose a battle than to win through deception. The Persian reputation for honesty was so strong that Greek ambassadors would sometimes take Persian oaths more seriously than their own countrymen's. At the bottom of this rigid hierarchy were the Marduk, agricultural laborers bound to state-owned land. They weren't technically slaves. They couldn't be bought or sold as individuals, but they also weren't free. Entire families would be relocated to inhospitable territories, swamplands, salt-poisoned fields, the edges of new irrigation projects. They worked from dawn to dusk regardless of age or gender, received fixed rations from government stores, and had no access to temples or courts. If they fled and were caught, they might be branded or reassigned to even worse conditions. When they died, their bodies weren't given to the Dakma. They were considered too impure for proper Zoroastrian rites. They were simply buried in the earth or dumped in dried canals, treated as the pollution they had always been considered to be. Yet even here, the paradox persists. The same empire that created this underclass also built the Royal Road, the first long-distance highway system with rest stations every 15 miles. They invented a postal service so efficient that Greek historians marveled at it. They created administrative systems that managed dozens of ethnic groups and languages without attempting to erase local cultures. The Persian system was brutal, yes, but it was also functional in ways that wouldn't be matched until the Roman Empire centuries later. At the apex of all this sat the Shah, and approaching him was like approaching the sun. necessary for life, but dangerous if you came too close. Looking directly into the Shah's eyes was forbidden, not as a courtesy, but as a fundamental law of cosmic order. The Shah was chosen by Ahura Mazda, the highest god, linked directly to Asha. The gaze of an ordinary person could defile his presence. Even generals, high priests, and favored scribes spoke to him while looking at the ground or the wall. One account from the historian Ctesias describes a guard who accidentally met the king's gaze and was executed on the spot, without a word exchanged. No trial, no appeal. He had crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. When a Shah died, his face remained covered. His body was never displayed. His name wasn't spoken for days. To look upon a dead king was considered just as dangerous as gazing at a living one without permission. The transition of power was a moment of cosmic vulnerability, when the divine order hung in the balance. Everything had to be controlled, ritualized, performed with precision. Even artists who created royal portraits never worked from life. They relied on verbal descriptions or clay casts, painting the idea of the king rather than his actual face. This brings us back to where we began, to those towers under the open sky, to the question of what these customs really meant. The Greeks who recorded them, Herodotus, Ctesias, Plutarch, struggled to understand. They saw barbarism mixed with sophistication, cruelty intertwined with justice, beauty built atop horror. But maybe they were asking the wrong question. Maybe the point isn't whether ancient Persia was good or evil by our standards. Maybe the point is that they built an entire civilization on a single terrifying premise: that purity and order matter more than comfort, more than individual suffering, more than even death itself. The towers still stand in places like Yazd, silent stone circles open to the sky. No vultures come anymore. No bodies are laid out in careful rings. But on certain mornings, when the wind moves through those ancient stones, you can almost hear the echo of wings, the rustle of feathers, the quiet efficiency of a culture that turned death into ritual and ritual into cosmic duty. They believed they were protecting the world from corruption. They believed every brutal act, every shocking custom, every incomprehensible law was necessary to maintain the balance between creation and chaos. And here's the thought that should haunt us as we return to our own time. They weren't monsters. They were human beings, as intelligent and thoughtful as anyone alive today, who looked at the same fundamental questions we still grapple with. How do we maintain order? How do we define justice? How do we honor the dead? And arrived at answers we can barely comprehend. The gap between their normal and ours isn't a measure of how far we've come. It's a reminder of how radically different the human answer to what is right can be, depending on what you believe about the nature of reality itself. The towers remember. The stones record. And somewhere in the desert wind, the question remains. If they could see our customs, our ways of death and justice and purity, would they find them any less shocking than we find theirs?